And welcome to the Take a Breather podcast with Stacy Eric and Eric Almeida. We are certified emotional freedom technique practitioners, and on this podcast, we discuss how EFT can help improve your mental and physical health by bringing real healing to the body and to the mind. We also have different types of practitioners visit us on the show to tell us about their methods and how they can facilitate deep healing. As always, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, like and subscribe to us on YouTube. That helps out the podcast a ton. And today we have Katherine Golub. She is a career and leadership coach and the founder of the Center for Callings and Courage. Welcome so much, Katherine, to the podcast.
Thank you. It's so great to be here with both of you. Thank you for having me here.
Ditto. And Stacy, take it away with the first question.
Yeah, you can start off just telling us about you and what it is you do. And I know you've done lots of really fascinating things over the course of your career and how you came to be a career and leadership coach.
Sure. Yeah. So I primarily work with change makers who are burnt out and who are really uncertain about what's next in their work lives. And the words that they use most frequently when they come to me to describe what they want are clarity, confidence, focus, and balance. And so I help them get clear about what's next in their work lives and to develop the confidence that they need to make that a reality, and to, when things change in their lives, to keep getting clear and confident about what's next in their lives.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Nice. So how did you get to this point in your life that you're offering this? You have a really interesting history. I'd love to hear some of the details.
Yeah. So I launched my full-time coaching practice back in January 2013. So I've been doing this full-time for about 8.5 years now. And before that, except for waitressing in high school, all of my early work was in one way or another doing community organizing, activism. When I graduated from college, I've been working to pass anti-sweatshop legislation in Connecticut, and was working closely with the hotel workers union. So went to work with the hotel workers union in strategic affairs for a few years. But then a whole bunch of life circumstances happened. First, my partner, who was undocumented and Mexican at the time, was picked up driving to work and deported. And I moved from Connecticut to Phoenix to be closer to Mexico. And then a few months after I moved to Phoenix, discovered I was pregnant. And then couldn't continue my work and was like, what am I doing with my life? And I moved to Oaxaca, Mexico, and I was 7 months pregnant and couldn't continue my work with the union. Didn't know what I was going to do. And quickly decided, okay, I'm going to become a birth doula and a childbirth educator and a yoga teacher, and did those things for a few years, but ended up separating from, we happily co-parent, actually just went on vacation together but I'm separated from my son's father and couldn't doula or teach classes on the weekends anymore. So like, what do I do during the days? And I had really been getting a lot out of helping my pregnant clients navigate through rites of passage, around becoming parents. And so really wanted to help people experience similar transformation. And the way to do that during the school hours as a single mom was to become, that long story short, very long story short, was to become a coach. So I launched my coaching practice in January 2013.
That's so fascinating. So you went from helping people usher in new life as a birth doula to then just kind of broadening that to helping people usher in their own new life or their own new path in whatever, whether it was career or with their life or things like that. It's very, very, that's so cool. That's so awesome. While being a single mom, which isn't easy.
It wasn't easy, no. Yeah, when I first started, my first coaching training was as a health coach, but very quickly I realized that people weren't coming to me for health, physical health related issues. They were coming to me for work related issues. And luckily, I wasn't expecting to, but luckily I was really able to source from the trainings I had done previously, my birthing from within training, forest yoga training. I did a year-long apprenticeship in the 4 agreements. And so it's like, oh, I guess I'm sourcing from these other trainings to support people with the work. I've done a lot more training since then, but yeah, it makes sense to me in retrospect that I help people, you know, give birth to the next phase of their lives. But I wasn't expecting that when I started this work.
It is interesting how the principles are the same. And also something that stuck out for me too, it just pinged in my brain, is, you know, the idea of pregnancy and birth being a rite of passage.
Yeah.
And, you know, as humans, I think we all crave ritual and we crave markers of, we all have rites of passage, but it's rarely like acknowledged or even necessarily gone through in a conscious way. And interestingly, it's like we've, as a culture, culturally, because of capitalism, and we've adopted the transition of being dissatisfied with a career that was picked up at a young age, often for the wrong reasons. It's a rite of passage to get out of that. It's a transition, like figure out who we are, what we actually want to do with our lives, finding meaning in our lives. Like that's become the new rite of passage. At some point in our lives, we do that transition that you in fact help midwife people through into their new career or new phase of life or whatever.
Yeah. Now I'm working on I actually just completed a manuscript of a book, and the working title is When You're Standing at Life's Gate. And the imagery of the gate and the threshold, really, that was a lesson from birthing from within and from having to cross over so many gates, literal and figurative, as I moved back and forth to Mexico for 4.5 years when Kai was born. But yeah, we don't celebrate or honor these moments in our lives unless we do reach out for the support and, you know, and say, this is really important. I'm going through something really important that deserves honoring and support right now. But it's true. Yeah.
Well, you're even more necessary in our culture, because I mean, I know I did something similar where I said, my parents lost their minds when I was dissatisfied with being a high school English teacher, and said, I'm getting laid off and I'm staying laid off until I figure out my next phase. And, you know, oh my God, but you're losing the retirement. And like the people around me were not celebrating with me whatsoever. Yeah. Right. They were all in a place of fear about this leap into the unknown, rather than it being you're trying. There was none of the excitement or encouragement or honoring of my decision. It was all about staying in a place of safety. So like, I can see why there's, you know, coaches are even more critical, because there aren't many places to go to for support when you've decided to make this kind of a leap into a new career.
Yeah. No, it's, I work with clients a lot on working with their voice of doubt, and there's inner voices of doubt and there's outer voices of doubt. The outer voices are other people. Like the voice of doubt is the part that says, yeah, but what if that happens? And yeah, but what if that happens? Yeah, but what if that happens? And the voice of doubt always has a positive intention for us. There's always a positive intention. There's always a need that it's afraid that we won't meet. But when it is always just, but what if, and that's the only part that we are able to listen to, then we get stuck. And so often the voice of doubt is afraid that we won't meet our need for belonging. And that we will trespass, that we will we will break the rules of belonging that we have been taught to comply with. And belonging as humans is one of our most important needs. So we need people who have also gone on rites of passage, who've already gone on their own journeys, who have made it back safely, and who can then help us to, find our own path safely. Yeah.
Nice. So that's one of the things you mentioned as far as people having the self-doubt block to having career clarity. What else would you say is your common blocks people tend to have? I think there's blocks people have that they don't know that they're blocks. They think that they're being reasonable. Right. And I'm wondering how often you see stuff like, that's one category of things I can see being, that's not a block. That's just me being, playing it safe, or making sure I can pay my mortgage, or making sure, I am not putting myself in a dangerous position financially, and versus it's a block rather than an actual thing to worry about. That there are ways people aren't willing to think about to get around, to make it feel safer. I guess I'm kind of saying a lot of things all at the same time. I'm curious.
There's
think of any of those things I just said and run with it.
And there's so many different pieces that I could respond to. No, but because it's a lot, right? Because it's a lot to, it's a lot to try to change your life, right? So, well, one thing that comes up is how I define being stuck. And I want to start by saying, there are real structural challenges to meeting our needs in this society. And so it's not just a projection or a story if, someone's a single mom that doesn't have child support and is working minimum wage jobs to try to make ends meet, and racism and patriarchy and ableism and ageism and right. So though there are structural reasons why it is hard to find really fulfilling work in our society, and those must be acknowledged. Right, then there's also steps that we can take, right? Then there's support that it's this stuff is all nuanced, but I want to start by acknowledging that's the reality for a lot of people. And when I talk about getting stuck, and where most of my clients come feeling stuck, is how I define being stuck is, you want to do something and you do something else, right? Right? Or you don't want to do something and you do it anyway. Or there's two parts of yourself that are battling it out inside of you. And stuckness happens when we, when it's like we are buses driving through life, and a part of ourselves that we don't want to grab the reins or grabs the steering wheel and is driving the bus down the highway. And that's and it's wait, how do I regain the steering wheel? That's stuckness. And so even that, no matter our circumstances, we have choice to choose our next steps. It's just the steps that we have to choose are informed by our level of privilege. But yeah, so I see my clients come to me because they're stuck in behavior patterns or stories that have taken over the wheel of the bus, or take over occasionally the wheel of the bus, and they want to develop the agency and confidence and trust in themselves to be able to drive their bus where they want to go.
It sounds like you're talking about parts work here.
Yes, lots of parts.
And I know you've parts work being actually, do you want to describe for people listening what parts work is?
Yeah, because I don't have a clue what you're talking about.
So okay, sure. Yeah. So so when I first learned this work, it was about 10 years ago, because there can be a lot of different lineages of parts work. And the lineage that I studied with was the lineage of the Four Agreements, written by Don Miguel Ruiz. And he, in that book, talks about the judge and the victim. Then I studied with someone who had studied with him for 10 years, Alan Hardman, and he takes it to another level and talks about the strategy children. So when we are born, we come into this world as like utter acceptance. When we're sad, we cry. When we're need to poop, we poop. When we're fascinated by something, we'll stare at it until we're not fascinated by it anymore. We don't second guess or censor ourselves. There isn't any notion of right or wrong or good or bad, or I should be doing this thing or I shouldn't be doing that thing. I just am accepting of myself and others, right? And at the same time, we come in as human beings who need belonging, right? We have a need for belonging immediately to meet our needs. We're social primates who need to belong to a group in order to get our needs met. So also immediately we come into the world being like, okay, what are the rules of belonging in this group that I belong to? And how do I comply with them in order to meet my needs? And in response to what we're learning, we develop strategies to meet our needs. So if we notice in class that we messed up, but then we made the other kids laugh, oh, I have belonging in the class because I'm making other kids laugh. Maybe I develop a class clown part of myself. Or, oh, I just got good grades and my parents were so pleased, and that's like how I can please my parents so I can develop an achiever part of myself. Or, oh, my mom's really struggling, and if I don't, take care of my little sister and make the dinner, and then the stuff's gonna go bad. and we develop a pleaser or caretaker part of ourselves. And so we develop these different strategies take on kind of lives of their own. And this is why we call them strategy children, right? They've had developed different parts of our own. And my clients come to me primarily because they come with very strong giver, achiever, pleaser parts of themselves. And I often just refer to them as parts. And for many years also, I was told that my work was just like internal family systems. And finally read a couple books on internal family systems. I was like, oh, this is totally complementary. And so I often, when my clients, very stuck, meaning if they're not getting a lot of transformation in the first month or 2 or 3, I will recommend if they're still stuck, I will often recommend that we add an internal family systems therapist to our team. And work is very, very compatible and effective as well. I'm sure there's other lineages, but those are the two that parts work.
Yeah, nice. I've had quite a bit of experience with internal family systems myself lately, and it's the parts. It seems it's the same way that agriculture sprung up all over the world concurrently. People just figured that out. The idea of parts seems to have done the same thing. Like there's everyone all at once is like, oh, we all have parts. We're all basically have multiple personalities that has a dominant personality, but the multiples certainly have their say and pop up in times of stress to deal with the stressful situation that they've in fact internal family systems, often that's the linear, or the concept is that there's parts that also spring up to deal with a specific stressor that was unmanageable when we were children.
Yeah.
And bringing healing to those parts that believe they have to do this one job, or something really bad is going to happen, and that often means doing lots of behaviors to keep us safe.
Right.
So if in fact the need for safety and belonging is so strong, it's really no wonder. And then we have all these parts that are also trying to encourage us to be as safe and just as safe as possible, that working with you, I could see where those parts would definitely come up and need to be addressed in order to make those transitions that you're looking for with career clarity.
In IFS, they call what I say strategy children, they will say protector parts. They're there, they're all there. The work is not to get rid of any of the parts. The work is to learn how to choicefully interact with them. And I would say that, there may be some parts that are more dominant or more active. Really, the work is to be in what I call a compassionate witness place. In IFS, I call it the self. Lots of different names for this, but the kind of the one who chooses, the one who witnesses and knows that they're all acceptable. The point isn't, the master is aware of 1,000 masks. The work isn't to get rid of the masks. The work is to be able to choose which ones to take on as appropriate and as they meet our personal needs and collective needs.
And I love too, another piece of internal family systems is that often it's a matter of simply asking that part if they'd like to wear a different mask or have a different job. They're already they're ready to fight for us and ready to be there supporting us. So instead of shutting my mouth when I'm trying to speak up for myself, is there something else you'd like to do instead? Because we don't need to do, that we're safe and we're able to speak for ourselves and it's all going to be fine. So now knowing that's true, what would you like to do instead? And often it's these really creative parts or really, that have been doing this other job instead that has been in place for such a long time to keep us safe. But in fact, there's like this extra energy and extra access to ourselves once they're no longer burdened with that particular role in our lives anymore.
That's right. They have quite a lot of skills. It's just learning when to use them.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I can see a huge piece of your work with your clients, like just learning to be a compassionate witness for the self is huge. I assume it sounds like a big piece of like the initial piece is really would be all about that, because we're so not used to A, taking care of ourselves, or B, seeing ourselves in a positive light, or in not it's also like the parts and the formation of the parts allows us to let go of our self-blame also. Since they're formed by circumstances and things outside our control and in reaction to other people. And it's just that there's an opportunity to welcome the self as a whole, the wholeness of the self and the value of the self. Yeah.
I'm not sure what words you just used, but there's something you were talking about, freeing up energy, that it takes so much work to judge yourself all the time. It takes so much work. And when you stop doing that, then you have so much more creativity and curiosity and potential to engage with people and to do what you want to do, rather than in my curriculum, there's 4 parts, and the first part, I call it, and it's definitely the biggest part, preparing your lens. It's if we're the bus driving through life, or we're driving through life looking through a windshield, it's so hard to drive when the windshield's all dirty with all the stories and patterns that make it hard to see clearly. And when we are able to witness clearly life and ourselves, and we're not looking through all this stuff, then it's so much easier to go where we want to go. Yeah.
Yes. I have to admit, I'm really curious about family constellations.
Sure.
As it's on the parts work process as well. Yes. Or work. It's another way to work with parts, or not so much.
Yes. And so systemic constellations is a methodology that's very compatible with parts work, and if you have a Venn diagram, there could be parts that they can cross over. And I have a friend who went through one of the systemic constellations trainings with me, who, also has a background in focusing and in nonviolent communication and in parts work. And he's they're all apps in an operating system. I imagine EFT is an app. It's not the operating system, but it's a really powerful app. So these apps can work together. But I'd be happy to share about what people might be wait, what are you talking about? Systemic constellations. Do you want me to share what this is?
I would love to know about family constellations, actually.
Go for it.
Sure. Yeah.
Or systemic, is it systemic constellations?
Well,
I've seen it. It's said both are
mhm.
the same
And
thing.
well, so systemic constellations encompasses family constellations, organizational constellations, and is so this is a methodology I discovered back in 2018 from my advisor with my MBA program. It was a very alternative MBA in collaborative leadership, and so she introduced it, and since then I've been, well, the 2 years after that, I haven't been so much in the pandemic, but really studied it intensively. So I still feel like a little bit of a novice, and it's transformed my work. So I'll name both of those things. So systemic constellations is a methodology that was originally introduced to the world by a man named Bert Hellinger, who's a German man who was a priest with the Zulu people in South Africa. And I want to name that was one of the lineages that I don't know. I want to name that I don't know how much of it arose from the Zulu people or from his other trainings, but I would definitely want to name them. And but he developed this over the years and started teaching it, and it's very complex. So I've tried to make it simple. The basic notion in one basic notion is that by representing various elements in a system, we can see things that we wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. So, for example, the very traditional way of doing this is you get a group of people together in a workshop. A client sits down next to the facilitator and says, okay, I'm dealing with this issue with my whatever. It could be a work-related issue, could be a health-related issue, could be a family-related issue. And the facilitator says, okay, let's choose a couple of people to represent various elements. So let's say it's a family issue. You might name your mother and yourself, and then two people will stand up and represent various elements of the system. And this is not psychodrama. It's the idea is that we are all connected by a field of information that when we are still enough and listen deeply enough, we're able to access, anyone can access. So when you represent, you're tuning into information that's accessible in the field. I haven't, because I did probably like 5 or 6 really in-depth trainings over the course of 2 years, but the last one was actually in the Netherlands, and it was came home like 2 days before the pandemic. So I haven't been facilitating group work like this. The good news is that it's just as effective when you use blocks or pieces of paper or in your mind's eye. And so I personally was really attracted to studying systemic constellations. So just the answer, Bert called it family constellations. A next generation took it and applied it to organizational and work-life issues. Systemic constellations just encompasses family, organizational, etc. You can have all sorts of different parts constellations. So it's just, and it's not related. It could be related. You could have an astrological constellation, but it's not, it's separate from like that type of constellation. And I'll say that when I lived in Oaxaca, it was like common, everyone was doing constellations, but I was like, oh, that astrology thing. I'm nothing against astrology. I just wasn't, I was like, I don't know. I don't feel the need for that right now. But it's all over Oaxaca. It's all over Mexico, Brazil. And when I was in the Netherlands, it's like, oh, you go to a coach or you go to a constellator. It's that common, but it's really not known in the United States. So yeah, go ahead.
So you have physical representations of these archetypes that exist in your life,
or actual people, or is it
they could be actual people,
in the system. Mm-hmm.
The elements in the system. Mm-hmm. And then so once whether you're doing it like you said with blocks or with individuals, what would be the next step that the person would be doing when they're in the middle of that, just to kind of
yeah. So So it would be hard. To say exactly what the facilitator would do would be it's hard for me to name exactly what that facilitator would do. By listening to the information that arises in the body. It's a very somatic practice that gives insights. By asking questions of representatives, or asking them to move in different places, or giving sentences, that can bring information and create resolution. But it's any different, just like a coach, you might say ask different questions. A constellator will ask different questions. Trying to think of an example. So can I bring this back to why I'll share why I studied it, and then how I'm using it with clients. That might be easier to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
So there were 3 situations that I would find my clients getting stuck in, that I wasn't completely confident with supporting them. One was when they would talk about a relationship with their family member, or something in the past that just kept coming up. It could also be a work-related trauma. Something just kept coming up from the past, and no matter how much I tried, they wouldn't let go of it, right? And I realized there was something else I needed to know. Another thing is making decisions. Like, no matter how rationally people would think about something, there was some information that was lacking to help people make really clear decisions. And then the third was in organizational dynamics, when things just felt like so complicated. I'm like, I don't know. That also felt hard. So in the family area, for example, how I might work with a client. So again, I'm not doing this with groups, I'm doing it with individuals. Often it comes up where, especially with patterns of overgiving, overachieving, overdoing, there's some oath that a client or that an individual has made to someone else that they're not conscious of. And just naming it is incredibly transformative. So one of the key principles of this work is that acknowledgement is the first step to healing. And often that's what's needed. Sometimes you don't need more than acknowledgement. So like a client who's had a few different clients who's had a sibling pass away when they were young. And one, we came to light after I would say, okay, in your mind's eye, place your brother and place yourself. How are you? What do you notice? What's happening? What do you feel in your body? And imagine being your brother, and imagine being yourself, and just seeing what happens. And then it's me in kind of intuiting or sensing into what are the words that might be appropriate, what needs to be acknowledged here. And so in one situation, a client might say, I promised that I would live your life for you. And that person feels like they've taken on the responsibility of living 2 lives. In another similar situation, they may have made the oath. They may have made the oath, I will not live my life because you couldn't. I will follow you into the grave. I don't deserve to live my life fully because you didn't live your life fully. And just like, I get chills saying that, just that acknowledgement is transformative. And yeah, that's one thing. Just that's a very long answer. I could talk about other things that might happen, but that's like those healing sentences. Just, this happened, or I'm sorry, or I'm heartbroken. And then choosing new goals. Okay, what will I do now? Please honor me as I live my life fully, for example.
No, that makes a lot of sense, because Stacy and I come across that same thing on the EFT world. It's
yeah.
You refer to it as an oath. We, on the EFT world, it's more like it's a limiting belief. It's you've signed some kind of emotional contract with someone, even if it's just yourself, and then you're stuck living by that contract. And then taking the space to acknowledge, oh, that contract is there and you signed it maybe when you were 10 years old or 5 years old. And it's like, oh my God, I didn't realize I did that. And I've been living my life by this contract, by this oath, by this belief.
Yeah.
And that makes so much sense. Like, once you have that acknowledgement of like, oh, like, you know, my brother was an artist and now he died and I'm trying to become an artist, but that's not my path.
Mm-hmm.
You know, or the other version of that, you know, my brother died, so I don't deserve to live because my brother is dead. And so like that level of self-awareness can bring that clarity of just like, what the hell am I doing? Like, that's not me. I don't have to do this anymore.
Yeah.
And that makes so much sense of like allowing there to be that space to be like, you know, here's yourself, here's this other entity that has this big influence in your life, whatever it is, and then allowing for there to be that awareness for it to come to the surface.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's really interesting. I've never heard of it done in that angle. I've heard of it from the EFT side. I've heard of it from the psychoanalytic side, from the hypnotherapeutic side. It's so interesting, like all the different avenues we go for the same kind of healing. That's so fascinating.
I think part of why, excuse me, I think part of why it is not as known about in the United States is because I think there's several reasons. But I think one is we've really shunned any honoring of ancestors. We as a collective, not that everyone shuns honoring of ancestors, but one of my teachers is, her name is Francesca Mason Boring, and she's bicultural Shoshone and European descent. And but she was really raised by her indigenous her Shoshone grandmother, and in her lineage, acknowledging the ancestors are very real. Acknowledging the ancestors is kind of commonplace in her, or I mean, it's not just commonplace, but it's part of life. Whereas white European descended folks would say ancestry worship is heathenry. Like that was something that was shunned, and I think continues to be very much out of the mainstream in this country. And Constellations does work a lot with ancestry, whether or not and I really appreciate that there's no like ancestors or this or that. It's just like, oh, we have ancestors, so let's work with them, whatever your concepts about them are. And so in Constellations work, we can identify that people also have these oaths or identifications with people they didn't even know existed. So the artist brother, right? It may be the artist grandfather who died before the child was born. And suddenly the child is doing the things that the grandfather would have. And that's not good or bad. Like the artistry, right? Like, oh, you may have your inheritance might be very like, that can be, it's not neither good nor bad, but it can be limiting when we don't recognize where these things come from. So if we're trying to complete our grandfather's life, we might feel like we're stuck, and we're like, no matter how much inner work we do on ourselves, we're like still in the old pattern. So Constellations can be really helpful in bringing these dynamics to light.
That's so true. Stacy and I were even talking about this in a previous solo episode that we did a while back about like we don't have elders in this country. Like we've abandoned that concept of elders and of passing on of wisdom, you know, and European countries have maintained some parts of that because their families are still more integrated than American families. So, you know, they still have a lot more multi-generational homes depending on the country compared to the United States, where it's like everyone's much more independent. And then when someone gets to quote unquote old, they get shipped off to the nursing home and then they're never dealt with again. And so it makes sense. It's so interesting that like there's this in the Western world, there's been this dilution the ancestral wisdom, and then it was diluted down to the elders' wisdom, down to the grandparents or the parents' wisdom, down to it's just your own. And you lose so much by just throwing all of that away.
Yeah.
And then, like you were saying, these patterns from the past keep replaying themselves, but then you're completely blind to that there's a pattern there. We see it with addiction, where addiction can be in a family. We can see it with money problems, where money problems could be in the family. And those are just very light examples that people in the Western world will be more willing to acknowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so much more there. And it's so unfortunate we've really walked away from that.
Mm-hmm.
Because Stacy and I talked about a lot about this too. Even our own intuition, our own internal wisdom, we've been taught to ignore in the Western world.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that the Western advances aren't valuable, but you don't throw away the past either. Like you need to have them both work together, the technology and the science with the intuition and the heritage and the history.
Right.
And that's where you can find true wisdom by interweaving both in our lives. And that's awesome that you do that with your clients through these techniques to kind of help them awaken themselves to their wisdom and to the paths that they're walking, and for them to discover they're walking the wrong path.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what comes up for me is this weekend I've been meaning to read this book for a really long time. The Smell of Rain on Dust by Martin Prechtel, on grief and praise. And in it, he writes that, I think it was like in 538, there was an edict from the Christian church that said that outlawed grieving at funerals.
Really?
Yeah, I would have to grab the book and read it to you, but it outlawed the show of excessive grieving at funerals. There was a cutting off. There was a systemic cutting off of grief, right? And if you think about what is trauma, it's a freezing in the system. The energy of grief is not allowed to pass through. And in our culture, American culture, I mean, if there is, there's not much space for grieving. We're also so atomized in our individual. We require each other. We need each other to grieve, to full-bodied grieving. But so the relationships in which you'd feel safe letting go in that way are seldom. So so often in systemic constellations, it'll point to, constellations is very different than typical psychotherapy that talks a lot about what happened and the stories of what happened. It's just the events, what are the bare bones of what happened? Oh, my grandmother's first love died as a young soldier and she had to marry my grandfather, but her heart was always in Europe and she was never able to fully be present. And my mother, and then she became an alcoholic, and my mother, this is not my personal story, but then my mother was always looking for her mother and wasn't able to be present to me. So instead of oh, my mother was a bad mother, and it's just oh no, that happened. Oh, I honor that happened. And I can allow myself not to experience some of that grief. That's really sad that happened. And I think as a white person in this country, the descendant on 7 lines, I'm the descendant of 4th or 5th generation from Europe, but on one of my lines goes all the way back to the 1630s. So if you go back that way, that long, you got lots of ancestors, right? It just multiplies, just doubles every generation. And there's a whole lot of moral injury that my ancestors perpetrated. And there's also a whole lot of moral injury that my ancestors experienced as indigenous European people way back, or in Poland, or in Sicily, or in Ireland, right? But when we're not able to acknowledge and grieve both what we have, the wrongs that our ancestors have caused and the wrongs that happened to them, we hold these things in our bodies. And the first step to, if we don't acknowledge what's happened, then it's so hard to move forward. And I think that's part of where we're at as a country, is that there's so much to grieve and acknowledge. Yeah.
No, for sure. Go ahead, Stacy.
I'm in the category of descendant of white Europeans who was told almost no stories about I know almost nothing about anyone older than my grandparents. And when you're working with someone, do you have techniques you use for people who don't have the story? They don't have the answer about why they have, they know they have the impulse to have, maybe they have the impulse towards addiction, or a predilection towards getting into a certain type of relationship, or do you look at as an opportunity to, well, maybe it's an ancestor, maybe it's something to do a vow, or like epigenetics is another facet of all of this, right? Mm-hmm. That in fact it could be our genes have been turned on in a certain way to encourage certain behaviors in us based on the attitudes and behaviors of our ancestors. Mm-hmm. Is there somewhere you go with it when someone who's like, I have this impulse, but I'm not sure, but I don't know why, or I don't have the story, I don't have the answer about why it started?
Yeah. So a few things. One thing is that, which doesn't yet answer your question, but is that
it's all good.
Part of the situation is that the stuff that's kept secret is the stuff that makes the most harm, right? Mm. So we won't have stories about a lot of this stuff, right? And I didn't know the 1630s thing until doing the Constellations work. I was like, oh, that's the line. My mother's line is the one where the most hard stuff has been passed on to me. So I knew I needed to look. And so it's really in the last year or two, like a pandemic has given me the time to do that research and just kind of confirm what I already felt in my body. So like most of the time, a lot of the time we won't know, or we might know if it's a sibling thing, right? We know our sibling passed away, but there also miscarriages and abortions can when not acknowledged, can also when anything is cut off and not acknowledged, that's so yes, my point is that you're right. A lot of the times we won't have these stories. So another part of the answer is I actually don't start with the Constellations work. And in a lot of my work with clients, it's not actually needed. Like this stuff fascinates me, and I'm so grateful to have it when it's needed. But it's like potent medicine. It's like I work with clients for minimum 6 months, and like one constellation may be needed, right? And so I use it when needed, and often it's not. But when it is needed, and they don't know what's when a client doesn't know what has happened. So I'm thinking about like last year there was a client who was having a relationship with a male colleague who didn't, like, he wasn't actually doing, it was just bringing, she was having a challenge with a male colleague. And she just had this like intense feeling of being violated. And she didn't have a history of sexual abuse or any of that. But it was as if interacting with this person brought up like a memory of sexual abuse. And she also didn't know, and her mother or her grandmother or anything, or her father, or she didn't have any story. So I was just like, okay, so let's just try something out and see how this feels. And I just had her say, and just in a really getting still and just saying, someone was raped. And that, just like that sentence, I'm just saying that, it's just an acknowledgement, someone was raped. And she can she knows someone was raped. So, given patriarchy, someone was raped. And she didn't, that was just her relationship with this colleague totally shifted. It had nothing to do with this colleague. But that acknowledgement was so freeing and so liberating, without any of the details of the story. It can really help to have the details of the story, but often we can't access them. So
that's so interesting, because it's on some instinctual level, that particular client had this unresolved trauma from their familial past. And at the same time, instinctually, that coworker embodied the perpetrator. And none of, like, this is certainly going very far potentially into the woo, but like the connection was still made. That individual was still like this person is a danger to me. And it's just they were living a script that was unresolved, a grief from the past that wasn't allowed to be felt and to be let go.
Mm-hmm.
And you doing what you did with the constellation work brought that, just allowed it to go to rest, and that it wouldn't carry on in her onto the next, that it could be put to bed finally, even with all the details being lost to time or to secrecy.
That's right.
Or both.
Yeah, lost into time and secrecy.
It's such a hopeful concept. And I'm thinking of, so knowing, I mean, as a body worker, EFT practitioner, I know our bodies gravitate toward healing. And I also have noted that it seems like it's really easy, it's kind of easy for us to get traumatized given the environments we can grow up in. And it's also can be really easy to heal from it. And that in fact, that simple acknowledgement can be such a healing experience. And it's, I have this whole can you imagine if it's like the 100 monkeys, there's like enough people believe a thing, then it just sort of permeates the whole species. Like if enough people acquire, I won't describe the whole 100 monkeys concept, but just at some point, a cultural takes on a certain belief system because enough people believe it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that if in fact, I mean, just in the United States alone, if enough people decided to acknowledge the trauma of their ancestors, the trauma caused by their ancestors, the way the trauma has affected them and their behavior, and just letting it be true. Like, yes, that is true. Yes, it's resulted in racism and sexism and ageism and ableism, and just simple acknowledgements could be so incredibly transformative to our entire country as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, absolutely. And also that when we bring excuse me, hold on one sec. When we bring the identification with ancestors into play, and that we know that if we don't acknowledge, we may become identified with unconsciously with people from the past who we've kept secret, right? So if we acknowledge, we then may be able to say, they did this happened, and because I'm aware of it, I'm not going to continue causing harm, because so much harm is continuing, right? It's not just the 1630s, it's today and yesterday and tomorrow. So if we can acknowledge and feel the weight of moral injury that was caused to us and that our ancestors caused, and say, wow, that's a lot, that happened, then we can have so much more awareness to not continue perpetuating harm and being identified, like, okay, ancestors, love you. You are who you are. I see you, I acknowledge you, and I'm not going to continue. I'm going to leave that in the past. And we can we can be liberated to not keep causing the same moral injuries.
You're muted, Stacy.
You're muted.
Thank you. My cat was scratching at the door. She wants to be in the podcast too. A quick little aside, I realize not everyone knows what moral injury is or how important a concept it is to be aware of.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So when we hurt someone else, it hurts us, right? If I do not honor my guiding principles of living with love and respect for my fellow human and non-human beings, it hurts me. It hurts my heart. It injures me. And so that is a moral injury, that if we do not live in accordance with our principles, with our morals, it hurts us. And so one way that this takes up, can I go to another level with this question? Is that so?
Go for it.
Absolutely.
So I know how this shows up in me and how it shows up in a lot of my white activist, organizer, high achiever clients is feeling the responsibility to pay the debts of our ancestors. So if my ancestors, and they did, if my ancestors took native land and engaged in the stealing of native land and were engaged, and I know now from doing some ancestry work in the last year, thanks to the time I've had during this year, were lieutenants and sergeants and generals in American Indian, quote unquote, American Indian wars, meaning slaughter of indigenous people. I hold that debt in my body. I'm not saying that I caused those things, but it feels like there's a agreement to pay those debts. And I can, when I acknowledge that, so that can lead to, for me, very high, very like I'm working all the time and organizing all the time, and right. And it doesn't serve anyone if I'm in a white savior role or if I am burning out. So if I can hold two things simultaneously, there is moral injury. Or this can also be with white folks whose ancestors owned slaves, right? Or did any people whose ancestors did any moral injury. Like we can feel a debt, right? So, and if I can, for me, part of my Constellations work has been about acknowledging what happened in the past and still feeling, I do believe that with privilege comes responsibility. And in this life, this body, this lifetime, I'm a white person with a lot of with the privilege of being white. I have a responsibility. But I can separate that so that it's not like I am unconsciously trying to pay the debts of my ancestors and therefore burning out and being in a white savior place, right? Because that's not going to help anybody. So it's a very nuanced thing. There's responsibility now, and there's a responsibility that my ancestors had that I can acknowledge what happened and leave with them. So that's how I interact. And a lot of my clients who come to me as burnt out change makers, one way that moral injury shows up. Does that answer your question, Stacy?
Yeah, it does. And actually, you went with it in a way I didn't know about moral injury. I actually, my reading on moral injury was more about stuff happening in this lifetime. That, but of course it would of course apply to the ancestors. I'm thinking of the child who witnesses someone being hurt and feels helpless and unable to do anything about it, suffers moral injury too. People, and I read an article about Afghanistan and some of the things that soldiers had to witness and couldn't do anything because they were done by people on their side, suffered trauma and moral injury from that experience. So of course it would be true as well that the ancestors' behavior would manifest as a moral injury too.
Yeah. And then the not holding space for soldiers to come back and grieve their experiences, whether that's witnessing people being killed or that's killing themselves when there's not space for soldiers. And that happens generation after generation after generation. That creates a whole lot of havoc.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, and again, it's easy to be overwhelmed with the idea of, oh, there's so much trauma, and it's trauma in present day and trauma in our ancestors, and that acknowledgement is so a huge piece of a real cure, such a huge piece of healing.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming, and it can bring people to even to a place of despair and cynicism, like, oh, that's so much, I don't know what to do. But then there's a level of like just of taking responsibility, of like maturity, of like, okay, and there's a simplicity to this. Okay, I am a human now. And I'm a grown-up now. And I'm going to acknowledge and choose, and acknowledge and choose, and acknowledge and choose. And it really, this is what I'm saying, like, there doesn't have to be constellations on everything. I only use them when really necessary. And often they're not, because it's like, okay, how do you feel and what do you need? And what does your community need? And what will you choose? You keep asking those 3 questions. How do you feel? What do you need? What does the world around you need? And what next step will you take? And you keep doing that over and over again. It's you're going to get somewhere. Yeah.
Nice. I think it's a really good way to pause that. Unless you have any other follow-up questions, Eric.
No, I think that's a great place to sum up.
Yeah. So how can people find you if they'd like to work with you, Katherine?
Sure. Yeah. So my website is callingsencourage.com. And I just launched an introductory course called The Orientation Practice, 7 Steps to Clarity. And it's actually a pay from the heart introductory course. And the orientation practice is basically the steps I just named: pausing, settling your body, noticing what's new and good, taking in the good, noticing how you feel, responding with self-compassion, asking what you need, asking what the world around you needs, and taking your next step. It's a week-long course. It's an introductory course to these teachings, and it's paid from the heart. But I really want to invite people to do it. And so for folks who are listening, I'm working on, and I think that by the time this posts, it'll be a possibility, figuring out the technology, but there will be a free code so that folks who've listened can get the course for free. And can we put that in the show notes? Because I don't want to promise a code right now and have it be the wrong.
Oh yeah, we'll put the code into the show notes. This episode won't come out till probably about a month after we've recorded it. So you can just message us the code and we'll put it into the notes there. So the listeners and viewers, look there for the code. The links to Katherine's website will be there as well. And you can definitely check out that introductory offering, which is awesome.
Yeah, so I recommend, thank you. I recommend that. Also my newsletter, there's a lot of, I would say I put a lot into it as an offering, not just like announcements, but there's a lot of teachings in there every week. And I send it out once a week and would invite folks to sign up for that. And also I'm pretty active on LinkedIn and Instagram, and share daily-ish teachings there, and really welcome folks to be in community and the conversation. I'm at Katherine Golub at both places. So.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And we'll put that in the show notes as well. And any final words of wisdom before we let you go?
Oh, I'm so grateful for this conversation. This is so much fun.
Ditto.
Yeah. Any last words of wisdom? Well, when you wrote me this question, Stacy, you added like words of wisdom for people who have no idea what's right for them. And I would say, I don't know if I've ever met someone who has no idea what's right for them. And if they think they have no idea what's right for them, they're often facing a really, really, really hard decision, right? They're like in a really big dilemma, or they're terrified to listen to their inner guidance. And so I'll repeat what I've said already, that when people get quiet enough and can quiet whether with EFT, whether with, a lot of the practices that I teach to help quiet the inner noise, when people can get quiet enough and settled in their bodies enough to listen to what they need, what they feel, what they need, and what the world around them needs, and then take the next like teeny tiniest baby step. They may not have any idea what to do a month from now or even tomorrow, but like, oh, I can do this one thing right now. And if we never have the answers for what's the best thing ever, but we can always do something. And we can always listen. There is a part of ourselves that knows what to do, even when we don't know what to do. And so there is that part is always there. And there's always something little that we can do. And if we keep taking that little step after little step after little step, we can get clear. And so, yeah. And the orientation practice really, really helps with that. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Katherine. It was a
Yes, thank you
lovely
so
conversation.
much. It's so interesting. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you too. Thank you so much.
Of course. And thank you, listeners and viewers. And we hope that you join us next week for our next conversation.